Cops shoot elderly black woman's dog, unaware she is a Supreme Court judge. Judge Amina Caldwell had always enjoyed the peaceful moments of her daily life. It wasn't often that she took time for herself, especially now that she had reached the later years of her life. But today, just like any other day, she took a quiet stroll through her suburban neighborhood with her dog, Duke. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm golden glow on the quiet street. The trees on either side of the road swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling softly. There was a calmness in the air, one that had come to represent the life Judge Caldwell had built for herself, a life of solitude and simplicity. Amina had seen it all in her long career. As a Supreme Court judge, she had made decisions that affected the course of the country. Her legal mind had earned her respect, and she had earned the trust of her colleagues and the people she served. But outside the courtroom, she was just another woman, enjoying the peace that only retirement could bring. She didn't need the spotlight anymore, and that suited her just fine. Her dog, Duke, was the perfect companion for her walks, an old, scruffy terrier who had been by her side for years. Duke wasn't the most energetic dog, but he was loyal, and their bond was strong. Today's walk was like many others. Amina's thoughts wandered to memories of her time on the bench. Her decisions had shaped the law, and yet she rarely spoke about them. It wasn't her style to boast. Instead, she found solace in the quiet moments, away from the demands of the courtroom. The soft patter of Duke's paws on the pavement was comforting, and as she walked, Amina allowed herself to lose track of time. But all of a sudden, the peace of the afternoon was broken. From behind her, the sound of a car engine grew louder. Amina turned her head and saw a squad car slowly pulling up beside her. It wasn't unusual to see police officers around here, but there was something about the way the car was driving that caught her attention. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The car came to a stop beside her, and the officers inside rolled down the windows. The officers were young, perhaps in their late 20s. They had been patrolling the neighborhood for a few hours, ensuring everything was safe. The two men exchanged a brief look before one of them spoke to her. "Ma'am, we've had reports of an aggressive dog in this area," the officer said, his tone polite but firm. "Your dog is off the leash. We're going to need to ask you to put him on a leash for safety." Amina was taken aback for a moment. Duke wasn't a dangerous dog. He was small, old, and had never shown any aggression toward anyone. He had always been well-behaved, especially with people. "He's not aggressive," Amina replied calmly, giving the officers a reassuring smile. "He's just excited to be out for a walk. He's harmless." The officer glanced at Duke, who was wagging his tail, clearly excited by the presence of the car. The dog wasn't barking or showing any signs of aggression. He was simply happy to see something new. The officer's face remained stern, but Amina could sense his hesitation. "We still need to make sure everything's under control. We'll need you to leash your dog." Amina understood the officer's concern, but there was no reason to escalate the situation. "Of course," she said, moving to grab Duke's leash, which was hanging loosely around her shoulder. But before she could react, something unexpected happened. Duke, perhaps startled by the sudden attention, began barking. His little body started jumping around excitedly, tugging at the leash that Amina was trying to secure. To the officers, it seemed like the dog was becoming agitated. The first officer's hand instinctively went to his holster, his eyes narrowing as Duke's barking became louder. "Get your dog under control," the officer shouted, his voice rising in volume. Amina froze, her heart racing. She had never seen the officer so tense, and she certainly didn't understand why he was reacting this way. She had spent years in a courtroom, observing people in moments of crisis, but this felt different. It was as if the officers had already made up their minds about what was happening. "Please, he's just excited," Amina said, trying to reassure them. "He's not dangerous. He's just a little dog." But the officer wasn't listening. He stepped back, positioning himself between Amina and Duke, his hand still resting on his weapon. Amina's anxiety grew. She could feel the tension in the air, the officer's unease blending with her own confusion. Duke's barking grew louder, more insistent, but it wasn't aggressive. It was the barking of a dog who had spent far too long in one place and simply wanted to get moving again. The second officer, who had remained silent up to this point, looked over at his partner and nodded. Amina couldn't understand why they were treating the situation like this. She had seen her fair share of tense moments in the courtroom, but nothing had ever prepared her for this. She felt as if her authority was being questioned in a way that was difficult to process. "Ma'am, we're going to have to take control of the situation," the first officer said, his voice now more forceful. Before Amina could respond, he pulled out his gun, aiming it at Duke. "No!" Amina shouted, her voice cracking with fear and disbelief. "Stop! He's not dangerous." She rushed forward, trying to get between the officers and her dog, but before she could react, the officer fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed down the quiet street, sending a shockwave through Amina's body. Duke yelped and collapsed to the ground, the pain from the bullet clearly taking its toll. Amina's heart sank as she rushed to her dog's side, her hands trembling as she tried to comfort him. "No, Duke, please no," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Her mind raced as she tried to understand what had just happened. She couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. The peace of her afternoon had been shattered in an instant. The officers stood there, frozen, their faces pale as they realized what they had done. The gunshot had been a reflex, an overreaction to a harmless situation. But it didn't change the fact that they had shot a dog that Amina loved dearly. The first officer looked at his partner, his face filled with regret. The second officer stepped forward, but he said nothing. He knew that nothing he could say would fix the mistake they had made. Amina knelt beside Duke, her hands gently stroking his fur as she tried to calm him. She felt helpless, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in reality. She had always known that things could go wrong in an instant, but she never imagined that it would happen like this, on her quiet street with her dog, in front of two officers who had misunderstood everything. Then, as she continued to hold Duke, something clicked in her mind. She had been a judge for decades. She had seen the system fail people in many ways, but never had she experienced it from this side. These officers didn't know who she was. They didn't know she was a Supreme Court judge. They didn't know that she had the power to change the course of events in a courtroom, but they would soon find out. The officers, now realizing who they had just wronged, looked at her in shock. "You're Judge Caldwell," one of them stammered. His voice was filled with confusion and disbelief, but the damage had already been done. Amina stood up slowly, her eyes still on her dog. She was shaken, but her voice remained calm as she looked at the officers. "You've made a mistake," she said, her words cutting through the tension in the air. "And I won't let this go." The scene that followed felt like something out of a nightmare. The police officers, who had acted in such haste, stood frozen as they processed the mistake they had just made. Amina was still kneeling beside Duke, her hand gently brushing his fur, trying to comfort him. She could feel his shallow breathing, and her heart sank with every moment that passed. She couldn't believe that just moments ago they had been taking a quiet walk, enjoying a peaceful afternoon. And now everything had changed. Duke's body was limp, and the blood pooling beneath him painted a horrifying picture of what had just transpired. Amina's eyes filled with tears as she whispered to her dog, willing him to be all right. "Please, Duke, please be okay, I need you." The officers seemed to come to their senses. The first officer, the one who had fired the shot, stepped forward hesitantly, his face pale with regret. His eyes darted between Amina and Duke, but he didn't know what to say. His actions had been rash, fueled by fear and misunderstanding. He had seen a dog barking and acted on instinct, but it was clear now that he had made a mistake, and it wasn't just any mistake. He had shot an elderly woman's dog, someone he didn't realize was far more important than he had imagined. I didn't mean to." The officer's voice was shaky, and Amina could see that he was truly remorseful, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. He had taken away something precious from her, something irreplaceable, and no apology could change that. Amina looked up at him, her eyes filled with pain and disbelief. "You didn't mean to?" she repeated quietly. Her voice was calm, but there was a coldness to it that made the officer flinch. "I don't think that matters, officer. You shot my dog, and now he's lying here because of your mistake." The second officer, who had been standing quietly off to the side, approached slowly, his eyes downcast. He too seemed to realize the gravity of the situation, and while he didn't speak, his body language conveyed his regret. Amina could tell that he was struggling with the reality of what had just occurred. But the truth was that it didn't matter how they felt now. The damage had been done. Amina stood up, her knees stiff from kneeling for so long. She wiped her eyes, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She wasn't sure what to do next. Her first instinct was to demand answers, but she knew that wasn't going to help. What could they possibly say to make up for what had happened? There was no excuse, no justification for their actions. "Get your supervisor here," Amina said, her voice steady but firm. "Now." The officers looked at each other, unsure of how to proceed. They had never encountered a situation like this before. Sure, they had been called to deal with dog complaints before, but nothing like this. They had never shot an animal in the line of duty, let alone the dog of someone like Judge Caldwell. Still, they knew that there was no way they could fix what had happened, but they had to make things right somehow. One of the officers grabbed his radio, speaking quickly into the mic, requesting a supervisor. Amina could see that the officers were still trying to figure out what to do. The silence between them was heavy, and the sound of Duke's soft whimpering only made the situation more unbearable. Amina's mind raced, her thoughts a blur. She wanted to do something, anything, to fix the situation. But she knew that there was no simple solution. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the courtroom. She had spent so many years making decisions that affected people's lives, hearing arguments, analyzing evidence, and rendering judgment. And yet here she was, a judge herself, in a position where she had no control over the situation. No matter how hard she tried, no matter how much she wished for things to be different, there was nothing she could do to bring Duke back. Her mind began to clear, and she realized something. She wasn't just any judge. She was a Supreme Court judge. A woman who had spent years making decisions that affected the very fabric of the law. She had fought for justice, for fairness, for what was right. And now it was her turn to fight for what was right again, not in a courtroom, but in the streets for her beloved dog. The supervisor arrived a few minutes later, a middle-aged man with a stern expression on his face. His uniform was crisply pressed, and he carried himself with the authority that came with his rank. He had been briefed on the situation over the radio and had already heard the details from the officers. He looked at Amina, taking in the scene with a glance. Amina took a deep breath and stood a little straighter. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep her composure, but she was determined to see this through. "I want to know why my dog is lying here bleeding on the ground," she said, her voice unwavering. "Why was he shot? And why were you handling the situation like that?" The supervisor's eyes flickered to the officers and then back to Amina. "Ma'am, I understand that this is a serious matter," he began, his voice calm but guarded. "But we need to get all the facts straight before we can make any statements." Amina's patience was wearing thin. "The facts are clear, officer," she said, her voice tight. "My dog is lying here because your officers decided to shoot him. The fact that you're asking for more facts is irrelevant. The truth is right in front of you." The supervisor nodded slowly, his face serious. He didn't argue because he knew she was right, but he was also aware of how complicated this situation was going to be. Not only had one of his officers made an egregious mistake, but the woman who had been wronged was no ordinary citizen. Amina Caldwell wasn't just anyone. She was a Supreme Court judge, someone who held immense influence and respect in the legal world. This was a case that would attract attention from all over the country, and no amount of excuses would be enough to justify what had happened. "I'm going to need a statement from all of you," the supervisor said, his tone more authoritative now, "and we'll need to investigate the situation thoroughly." Amina wasn't interested in a statement. She wasn't interested in more apologies. She had heard enough of those. What she wanted now was justice. She wanted accountability, and she wasn't going to stop until she got it. As the officers began to gather information and prepare their statements, Amina turned back to Duke. The dog was still breathing, though it was clear that he was struggling. His eyes were wide with fear, but he was still alive. Amina didn't know how much time she had left, but she wasn't going to leave him here, not like this. She gently scooped him up into her arms, her heart heavy with grief. She would take him to the vet, and she would do everything she could to save him. But she knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready for it. She had fought for justice her entire life, and now she would fight for Duke. The officers watched as Amina carefully cradled her dog in her arms. There was nothing they could say to make the situation better, but they knew one thing for sure. This was a mistake they would not forget. Amina walked away from them, her head held high. She didn't need their apologies. She didn't need their sympathy. She knew what she had to do, and she wasn't going to stop until she had the justice that Duke deserved. The next few hours were a blur for Amina. As she sat in the back of her car, her dog Duke cradled in her arms, She felt the weight of what had happened sink in deeper with each passing minute. She kept her gaze fixed on her dog, his body still limp but his breathing growing steadier. Duke wasn't out of danger yet, but she was holding on to hope, even if the odds seemed grim. Amina had spent most of her life dealing with cases that shaped history. As a Supreme Court judge, her decisions had been significant, but none of those moments compared to the quiet chaos of what had just occurred. Here she was, caught in an unfair situation, forced to fight not in a courtroom, but in the streets for her dog, the very animal who had always been there for her. She couldn't help but wonder why, despite all her years of experience with the law, she felt so powerless in this moment. She made a promise to herself that she would never let this incident slide. It wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. It was about ensuring that the same mistakes weren't made again, especially when it came to people and animals who couldn't defend themselves. After Duke was seen by the emergency vet, Amina took him home. She was exhausted, both mentally and emotionally. The adrenaline from earlier had worn off, leaving her drained. Her body ached from the tension she had been holding, but she knew she couldn't rest just yet. There was so much left to do. That night, Amina couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Duke on the ground, bleeding, his body still and motionless. She could hear the officer's voice in her mind. "We need to make sure everything's under control." But Duke hadn't been out of control. Duke had simply been excited, just as any dog would be when seeing strangers. It wasn't the first time Amina had walked him without incident, and it certainly wouldn't have been the last if things had been handled differently. The next morning, she got up early, her mind already on the task ahead. She wasn't one to let things go easily, especially when it came to justice. She had been a judge for decades, and she knew exactly how to navigate the legal system. This wasn't a case of simple negligence, it was a case of excessive force, and the consequences needed to be addressed. Amina called her lawyer, Nathaniel Woods, who had represented her on several matters over the years. He was a trusted ally, someone she knew would give her sound advice. "Nathaniel, I need you to look into the officers who shot Duke," she said, her voice steady but filled with resolve. "I want to file a formal complaint." Nathaniel listened carefully as Amina explained the details of the incident. After a long pause, he spoke. "Amina, I understand why you're upset, but you have to be cautious about how you approach this. These officers are going to have their own version of events, and we need to be prepared for that." "I don't care about their version," Amina replied, her voice sharp. "They shot my dog. There's no justification for that. I want justice, and I won't stop until I get it." Nathaniel sighed but knew better than to argue with her. "All right, I'll start gathering information and work with the police department's internal affairs, but you need to be prepared for the media attention this is going to bring." Amina knew he was right. She had a long history of working with the media, and she understood how quickly a story could spiral out of control. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about her. This was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly by those in power. It was about raising awareness of how quickly the system could turn against the very people it was meant to protect. Over the next few days, the story of what had happened to Amina and Duke spread like wildfire. The news outlets were quick to pick up the details, especially after it was revealed that Amina Caldwell, a well-respected Supreme Court judge, had been the victim of this senseless act. Interviews with neighbors and friends painted a picture of Amina as a kind and thoughtful person, someone who had always treated others with respect and dignity. But it wasn't just her reputation that caught the media's attention. It was the fact that an elderly woman had been wronged by the very people who were supposed to protect her. As the public outrage grew, so did the pressure on the police department to take action. The officers involved were placed on paid administrative leave while an investigation was launched. Amina knew that the department was trying to save face, but she wasn't interested in their apologies. She wanted real consequences for the officers who had made a rash decision without thinking. She wanted them to be held accountable. The weeks that followed were filled with legal meetings, interviews, and endless paperwork. Amina found herself facing the public eye in a way she had never experienced before. People rallied behind her, not just because she was a judge, but because they saw her as someone who had been wronged by a broken system. But it wasn't all support. Some people, especially those who were quick to defend law enforcement, criticized her for making a mountain out of a molehill. They argued that it was just a dog and that the officers had acted out of fear. But Amina wasn't swayed by their comments. She knew that the situation had gone far beyond just a dog. It was about power, control, and the fear that often led to mistakes. If people in positions of authority couldn't be trusted to make sound decisions, then how could the rest of society expect to be treated fairly? She spent long hours reviewing the evidence, speaking with experts, and preparing her case. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The investigation into the police officers involved was moving slowly, but Amina wasn't about to let the process drag on without pushing for action. She knew how the system worked. Sometimes it took pushing the right buttons to get things moving. Through it all, Duke remained by her side, recovering slowly but surely. His injury had been severe, but thanks to the quick thinking of the vet, he was healing. Amina felt a deep sense of relief every time she saw him wag his tail, his energy returning in small bursts. He was her companion, her friend, and seeing him suffer had only fueled her determination to make sure that the officers who caused him harm were held accountable. By the time the department's internal affairs report was released, the media attention had reached a fever pitch. The investigation had concluded that the officers had acted inappropriately, and while they were not facing criminal charges, they were being reprimanded for their actions. One of them was placed on probation, while the other was reassigned to desk duty. It wasn't the harshest penalty, but it was something. It was a step toward accountability. Amina knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a much larger conversation about police reform, about how officers were trained to handle situations with animals, and how people in power often made decisions that had far-reaching consequences. She continued to speak out, advocating for change and sharing her story with the public. The media attention eventually died down, but the issue remained alive in the hearts of those who had been touched by Amina's courage. She wasn't just fighting for justice for Duke anymore. She was fighting for every person and animal who had ever been treated unfairly by those in power. And in that fight, she found new purpose, a purpose that went far beyond her role as a judge. As Amina sat in her quiet home with Duke by her side, she couldn't help but think about how much had changed. It wasn't just the outcome of the case that mattered. It was the fact that she had stepped up, spoken out, and made a difference. In that moment, she knew that justice was not something that came easily or without struggle, but it was worth fighting for every single time. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Amina. The media's coverage of her case seemed to grow by the hour. News outlets across the country were picking up the story, and it wasn't just about her. It was about how an elderly woman, a Supreme Court judge, had been wronged in her own neighborhood by the very people who were sworn to protect her. The outrage surrounding the incident was palpable. People from all walks of life, lawyers, activists, ordinary citizens were calling for justice, for accountability. Amina had become a symbol of resilience, and her cause had captured the hearts of many. As the pressure mounted, the police department felt the weight of the public's scrutiny. The officers involved in the shooting were placed on leave, and the department launched an internal investigation. Amina had expected this, but it still felt hollow. She knew that a few days off, a few weeks of review, wouldn't be enough to address the deeper issues at play. She wanted more than just a slap on the wrist for those responsible. This wasn't a simple matter of a dog being shot. It was a matter of respect, of authority, and of power being misused in a situation that could have been avoided altogether. Meanwhile, Amina was bombarded with calls, emails, and messages of support. The public had rallied behind her, but it also brought new challenges. She had become the face of a much larger issue, and with that came not just praise but also criticism. People who didn't know the full story were quick to judge her. Some argued that it was just a dog, that she was making too much out of the situation. Others accused her of using her position as a judge to play the victim. But none of that fazed Amina. She had been through much worse in her career, and she knew how to block out the noise. What mattered to her now was that Duke was recovering. The sight of him wagging his tail every time she entered the room brought her a sense of peace that nothing else could. He was her constant, her companion through all the trials and challenges of her life. And seeing him bounce back from such a traumatic experience gave her the strength to keep pushing forward. Amina began working closely with Nathaniel, her lawyer, to prepare for the next steps. They were going to take action. But this wouldn't be just about compensation or disciplinary actions against the officers. No, this was going to be about ensuring that this kind of mistake didn't happen again. It was about using her voice to raise awareness of how the police needed better training when it came to dealing with animals. It was about understanding that not all situations could be resolved with force, especially when it came to pets who posed no real threat. The police department's internal review was moving slowly, but that didn't deter Amina. She knew that the system often worked at a glacial pace and that pushing for change would take time. But time was something she had. With her years of experience in the legal field, she understood how to navigate the complexities of the system. She knew that the harder she pushed, the more likely it was that things would start to change. Her case wasn't just about a dog anymore. It had grown into something bigger, something that resonated with people from all walks of life. Pet owners, parents, and citizens concerned with police accountability were all watching, and Amina wasn't going to let them down. She wasn't just fighting for Duke anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that didn't always serve them fairly. The department, feeling the pressure from the public and from within, eventually issued a statement acknowledging the shooting and promising to investigate the officers involved. But the response felt like a mere formality. Amina could tell that the department was only reacting because they had no choice. But for her, that wasn't enough. She didn't need their apologies or their reassurances. What she needed was concrete action. She needed to ensure that this kind of thing never happened again, not just in her case, but in every case. She wanted to be the one to make a difference, to ensure that both animals and people were treated with the respect they deserved. She wasn't just advocating for Duke. She was advocating for a future where officers were properly trained to handle sensitive situations and where mistakes like this were prevented. As she continued to speak out, more and more people began to lend their voices to her cause. Animal rights groups, legal professionals, and citizens across the country were joining in, showing their support. What had started as an isolated incident had blossomed into a movement, and Amina was at its center. She had always been a fighter, but this felt different. This felt like she was finally fighting for something that was larger than herself. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Amina still had to deal with the frustrations of the legal process. She spent countless hours meeting with Nathaniel, drafting documents, preparing for the next phase of the legal battle. It wasn't easy, but she had a sense of purpose now. She wasn't just doing this for herself or Duke. She was doing it for everyone who had ever been unjustly treated, for anyone who had ever suffered at the hands of those in power. The media continued to follow the story closely, and soon, Amina was asked to appear on national television to discuss the incident. It was a huge opportunity to speak directly to the public, and Amina was more than ready. She wasn't interested in using the spotlight to gain sympathy for herself. She wanted to use it to spread her message to make sure that people understood just how important it was to hold law enforcement accountable, not just when things went wrong, but all the time. On the day of her interview, Amina sat in front of the camera, her posture straight, her eyes focused. She had always been composed in front of the press, but today there was a fire in her that was hard to ignore. When the interviewer asked her how she felt about the police department's response, Amina didn't hold back. "They made a mistake, a serious one," she said. "And while I appreciate their acknowledgement, it's not enough. We can't simply say, 'Oops, we made a mistake,' and move on. This isn't about my dog. It's about accountability. It's about making sure that the officers who are supposed to protect us are properly trained to handle situations like this. And it's about ensuring that no one else has to go through what I've gone through." Her words were powerful, and they resonated with viewers. The interview was broadcast across the country, and soon, more people were joining the conversation. People began to see the larger issue at play, and they started to understand why Amina was so determined. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for change, for a system that didn't always serve everyone equally. As the investigation into the officers continued, Amina remained focused on the bigger picture. She knew that this was only the beginning. There would be more obstacles ahead, more hurdles to jump, and more people who would try to silence her. But Amina wasn't afraid. She had been through too much in her life to let anyone stand in her way now. In the weeks that followed, the case gained momentum. The police department made further changes to their training programs. and there was talk of introducing new protocols for dealing with animals during encounters. Amina wasn't sure if these changes would be enough to fully address the issue, but it was a step in the right direction. As she sat in her home with Duke by her side, Amina couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had fought for what was right, and though the battle wasn't over, she had already made a difference. She had raised her voice when it mattered, and she had shown the world that justice was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The days that followed Amina's television interview were a blur of emotions, phone calls, and letters of support. Her story had touched a chord with so many people, and the response was overwhelming. It wasn't just her case anymore. It had become a national conversation about accountability, fairness, and the power dynamics between the public and those sworn to protect them. People from all walks of life, pet owners, legal professionals, activists, and concerned citizens were reaching out, showing their solidarity. Amina sat at her desk late one night, reviewing legal documents with Nathaniel. Her mind was still processing everything that had happened, everything she had learned over the past few weeks. The police department had made an effort to apologize, to offer their sympathies, but Amina knew deep down that the apology wasn't enough. She didn't want their apologies. She wanted to make sure that this never happened again to anyone else. It was clear that the system needed a change, and Amina was determined to be the one who sparked that change. The public support had been heartening, but Amina knew the real battle wasn't in the headlines or the social media posts. It was in the small details of the legal process. It was in the steps that had to be taken to ensure that the officers involved faced consequences for their actions. And it was in the broader conversation about reforming police practices, especially when it came to how officers handled situations involving animals. As the weeks passed, the investigation into the officers involved continued. The police department had launched its own internal review, but Amina wasn't willing to sit back and hope for the best. She knew that true accountability would take more than just internal reviews and promises of better training. She wanted concrete actions. She wanted to see policies change. She wanted the public to know that this case wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger problem that needed to be addressed. The pressure on the police department was mounting. Community groups and legal advocates were joining forces, demanding that the officers face real consequences. They were pushing for changes in how officers were trained, particularly in situations involving animals. It wasn't just about better protocols for handling pets. It was about ensuring that officers learned to assess situations properly before resorting to force. No situation should escalate to the point where someone, or something, gets hurt. Amina's lawyer, Nathaniel, had been working tirelessly with the media, legal experts, and local community leaders to push the issue forward. They were determined to ensure that this case became a turning point, not just for Amina, but for the entire country. Amina's case had sparked conversations that had been brewing for years, and now the conversation was gaining momentum. As the case progressed, Amina was asked to speak at several public forums where she shared her experience and the lessons she had learned. She spoke about the importance of training, the need for police reform, and the responsibility that came with wearing a badge. Amina was careful with her words, knowing that this wasn't just about her. It was about using her voice to help create lasting change. She knew that by speaking out, she was not only fighting for Duke, but for every person and animal who had been wronged by a broken system. Though Amina was no stranger to public speaking, she had never imagined her life would take such a dramatic turn. She had spent her entire career in the courtroom, dealing with high-profile cases, but nothing had prepared her for the intense attention she was now receiving. She found herself facing the press, answering difficult questions, and navigating the complexities of being both a victim and a powerful advocate for change. The pressure was real. There were days when she felt overwhelmed, days when she questioned whether all of this was worth it. But then she would look at Duke, his wagging tail and warm eyes reminding her of why she was doing this. Duke was more than just a pet. He was her companion, her friend, and the reason she had found the strength to keep going when everything seemed impossible. Despite the chaos surrounding her, Amina kept moving forward, determined to see the process through. She knew that true justice wasn't just about punishing the wrongdoers. It was about ensuring that systems were in place to prevent such incidents from happening again. The public response had been overwhelming. But Amina knew that the real work was in the details. It was about the policy changes that would shape the future, about creating a legacy of accountability for years to come. A few months into the investigation, the police department finally released their official findings. The officers involved in the shooting were found to have acted inappropriately. While they would not face criminal charges, they were issued formal reprimands, and their training was flagged for review. The department promised to make changes to their training procedures with a special focus on how to deal with animals and prevent situations like the one Amina had experienced. It wasn't the most severe outcome, but it was a start. It was a step in the right direction. For Amina, it wasn't about the reprimands or the reassignment of the officers involved. It was about the changes that would hopefully come from this case, changes that could prevent future injustices from happening to others. She had seen firsthand how a simple misunderstanding could escalate into something far worse, and she was determined to ensure that no one else had to endure what she had gone through. But even as she celebrated the small victories, Amina knew that the fight wasn't over. She continued to speak out, using her platform to advocate for police reform and animal rights. She didn't want this moment to be a flash in the pan. She wanted it to be the beginning of something bigger, something that could bring lasting change to communities across the country. As Amina sat in her living room, Duke curled up beside her, she reflected on how far she had come. The pain of that day, the fear, the anger, the helplessness, was still with her. But the sense of accomplishment, the knowledge that she had fought for something greater than herself, gave her a sense of peace. She had spoken up when it mattered, and in doing so, she had sparked a conversation that needed to be had. The road ahead was still long, and there would be more challenges to face, but Amina was ready. She had fought for justice, for her dog, and for a better future. She knew that her work wasn't done, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. Duke was by her side, and together they would continue the fight, because justice wasn't just a matter of winning a case. It was a matter of making sure that the future was better for everyone. Months had passed since that fateful day, but for Amina, it still felt as fresh as it did in the beginning. The sting of the incident, the injustice of it all, was still deeply etched in her mind. However, the weight of what had happened had become somewhat easier to bear, thanks to the progress she had made. The road had been long, filled with obstacles, and yet she had remained steadfast in her pursuit of justice, for Duke, and for the greater cause she had unintentionally become part of. While the legal battle was far from over, Amina had found some peace knowing that the officers involved in the shooting had been reprimanded. She had spent months fighting for something she believed in, and though it wasn't the complete resolution she had hoped for, it was a step in the right direction. Amina wasn't someone who expected instant results, especially when it came to reform. Change took time. It took persistence, and it took people willing to speak out to challenge the status quo. The media attention surrounding her case had slowed down, but the effects of her actions were far from fading. Her story had inspired many, and over time, the public conversation had evolved into something deeper. The focus had shifted from the specific details of her case to a broader discussion about how police officers were trained to handle different situations, especially those involving animals. Activists, legal professionals, and concerned citizens continued to push for reform, citing Amina's case as one example of the systemic issues that needed addressing. Though the national attention had shifted away, the ripple effects were still being felt. Amina began to hear from others who had experienced similar situations, people who had been wronged by the same system that had failed Duke. She listened to their stories, shared her own, and found solace in the knowledge that her voice had made a difference. She knew that she was part of something much bigger than herself. It was no longer just about Duke. It was about every person who had ever been mistreated or misunderstood, every animal who had been hurt unnecessarily. And it was about making sure that those responsible for these wrongs were held accountable. Despite the public support, Amina continued to face challenges. There were still those who doubted her motives, who believed she was simply making a mountain out of a molehill. But she had long since learned to ignore the noise. She was no stranger to criticism, and she knew that no matter how much good she did, there would always be people who refused to see things from her perspective. But that was okay. She wasn't doing this for them. She was doing it for Duke. She was doing it for the future. She was doing it for justice. It wasn't just her own experience that motivated Amina. It was the countless stories she heard from people who felt powerless, from those who had been treated unfairly by law enforcement or by the systems meant to protect them. Her journey had awakened something in her, a renewed sense of purpose. She had spent so many years as a judge, listening to the struggles of others, but this was different. Now she was in the trenches, fighting for what she believed was right, and she wasn't going to stop. One day, as she was going through some papers at her desk, Amina received a call from Nathaniel. He had some news about the progress of her case and the ongoing discussions about police training reforms. She picked up the phone, her heart racing a little in anticipation. "Amina, I've just received word that the department has agreed to a comprehensive review of their training protocols," Nathaniel said, his voice filled with excitement. "They've agreed to work with experts in animal handling and de-escalation tactics to develop new strategies for officers." Amina's heart lifted at the news. This was what she had been hoping for all along. The officers involved had been reprimanded, but this was the real change she had wanted to see. A change that would affect the entire police force, ensuring that no one else would suffer the way she and Duke had. "That's incredible news, Nathaniel," Amina said, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. "It's the first real step toward change, but we need to make sure that the reforms are actually implemented, not just promised." "I agree," Nathaniel replied. "We'll keep pushing for transparency in the process, but this is a huge victory. It's the kind of change we've been advocating for." Amina allowed herself a moment to feel proud of what had been accomplished. It had taken months of hard work, and there was still more to be done, but this was a turning point. For the first time since the incident, she felt a sense of closure, knowing that her efforts had led to meaningful change. However, Amina knew that the journey wasn't over. There was still the matter of Duke's recovery to think about. The emotional toll of the incident had weighed heavily on both of them, but Duke had been resilient. Slowly but surely, his health improved. Amina spent every moment she could with him, offering comfort and companionship as he healed. It was clear that he wasn't just a dog to her. He was a constant presence in her life, someone who had been with her through thick and thin. She had promised herself that she would do everything she could to give him the best life possible. While she continued to advocate for broader reforms, Amina focused on her own healing as well. The pain of what had happened would never fully disappear, but she had come to accept that it was part of her story now. She would carry it with her as a reminder of the power of perseverance, of the strength it took to stand up for what was right, even when the odds were against you. One morning, as Amina sat by the window with a cup of tea, Duke lying at her feet, she reflected on the path she had walked. The journey had been difficult, and there were moments when she had doubted herself, but she had made it through. She had stayed true to her values, and in doing so, she had made a difference, not just for herself, but for others as well. It was a humbling realization, one that filled her with gratitude. She thought about the future. The reforms in the police department were just the beginning, and Amina knew that her work wasn't finished. She had started a movement, a conversation that needed to continue. There was more to be done to ensure that future generations didn't have to fight the same battles. Amina had always believed in the power of the law to bring about change, and now, more than ever, she was convinced of its potential. As Amina looked down at Duke, she felt a deep sense of peace. The road had been long and filled with obstacles, but it had led to something meaningful. They had both emerged stronger from the experience, and together they would continue to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The work she had started would carry on, long after this chapter of her life had closed. The changes she had fought for would ripple out, affecting countless others who might not even realize that their lives were being impacted. In the end, that was what mattered most to Amina, the knowledge that she had done something to make the world a little bit better, even if it was just one step at a time. With Duke by her side, Amina stood up, ready for whatever came next. She had faced adversity, but she had emerged victorious, and her fight for justice would never stop.